who of you think that coding is kind of like art or a creative form of sorts? Let's see, who thinks so? It's kind of controversial, right? But some people do, some people don't. It's about 60 to 40 for yes. All right, our next speaker actually kind of links to this, because other than being a software engineer, specifically a WordPress engineer, she's also a formally educated classical musician who worked for over a decade on at the Serbian National Theatre. So give it a round of applause for Milana Cap.
Before I begin, I'm going to tell you how we are going to finish. I'll give you a glimpse of how documentation is managed in a large open source community, the WordPress community. I'll add a few tips, make a couple of strong points on the importance of documenting everything, and you'll agree and find it quite relatable. That's because I'm skilled in making strong points. You'll even ask a few questions, maybe start reading some of the pages I recommend. You'll start making plans how from now on everything you do will be documented. We have a very close microphone here. So, okay, I'll be on this side. And tomorrow, you'll go back to old non-documentation life. Unless it's there. Unless you are already a member of an open source community or considering becoming one, and there is no handbook on how to be a member of that community. Or you are using this open source software in your project, but the latest version in documentation is 3 major versions ago. Or you are developing this magnificent software and you made it open source and set the license to allow everyone to use it, but it just doesn't get any contributions from random good people as it should. It's open source for Christine's sake. So now that we have established who this presentation is for, I hope the rest of you will want to try some of these roles by the end of the presentation itself. Being a part of an open source community is both liberating and enslaving. You're gonna love it. But first, I want to address a few misconceptions regarding documentation itself. We heard a lot of nice things about documentation today. So here comes, code should be self-documented. This kind of thinking is really elitistic and creates a community in a bubble. You're inviting only developers and only those developers who understand your code and the structure of your project. You're really inviting yourself. And you are missing out different use cases for your project, new feature proposals, new contributors. You're limiting the growth of your project in every possible way. The next one, excuse me. It's obvious how to use our software. Users will know. And this one is so not true. Even if your software is yet another email client, there will always be enough new users who will not know how to navigate it and will not use it properly. And being both developer and documentarian, this is probably my favorite. Real developers write code and have no time for docs. If you ever tried to write the docs, you'd know just how in-depth you need to understand the software and how many skills you need to be able to pass that knowledge. And once you try and realize this, you'll know for a fact that only real developers can write software developer docs. Besides, writing documentation is like exercising. Everybody should do it for at least half an hour a day. But if you don't have that time, you should do it for an hour. And these are just few of many misconceptions. We don't have time for all of them. And, you know, it is, yeah, I know. When you decide to write documentation, there are many challenges. It is never finished, and that's something to make peace with. it is never finished, and you really have to commit to it, because this is how the world looks like without documentation. It is interesting, yeah. Not very useful though. And this user obviously knows how to use this device. And regardless how many people are happy without documentation, there will always be those few never satisfied, always wanting more, and they will write it vigorously. Anyhow, open source communities. My first encounter with WordPress was in September 2009, and my first contribution to its documentation was a year and a half later, on May 12, 2011. Besides many tutorials found online, from the very beginning I was using existing documentation to assist my reckless development in local environment. But then I found some features and behaviors in my local WordPress that weren't documented. What? Me being a hold my beer type of person, couldn't stand this oversight, so I documented it. But it was easy to contribute in 2011. The early WordPress documentation, also known as Codex, was built on Wiki. And this has both good and bad sides. So, this means that anyone with WordPress.org account can edit any page. All you need is this one account at WordPress.org, and there is even a history of every edit, so you know exactly what happened and when. So even small contribution from each member of community would build in no time, right? When you think of it, Wiki does sound like a perfect tool for collaborating on open source documentation. The only problem with this is anyone with WordPress.org account can edit any page. Can you imagine everyone, 12.7 million people being able to edit any page? Project grew, gained more attention and more spam. It's a maintenance nightmare. The solution was more control over who has access to it. So the tool had to be changed. And really, what's a better tool than the one we were building? WordPress. So the migration of content was set in motion. First heavy load was differentiating end user documentation from developer documentation, making sort of catch and then start moving it. And by moving, I mean copy-pasting manually. Many Google spreadsheets, and a few years later, it was completed. Almost. But by fixing this one problem, which is spam and unwanted edits, another problem was created. It wasn't easy to contribute anymore. And when it's not easy to contribute, people stop contributing. Well, not me. When I realized there was documentation I couldn't edit anymore, I dug deeper to find out who did this. And I found them. This group of people who call themselves WordPress documentation team, and they make all decisions how documentation is going to look like and who can edit it. Well, I like making decisions too, so I joined them in September 2016. So now, in order to contribute, besides WordPress.org account, you need WordPress Slack account to communicate with documentation team, and then they might give you access to WordPress dashboard where documentation is created. And while we want to encourage people to contribute, we really have to be mindful of unwanted edits and possible mistakes, because that was the problem we wanted to fix. So granting access is a fine line and definitely a bottleneck. But that's not all. This new workflow created a need for a place where people can report issues they found. These kinds of changes in community dynamics require the ability to scale, to recognize problems, and to flexibility to adapt quickly, all of which we didn't do for a long time. So now, besides these two accounts, WordPress.org and Slack account, you need to know the workflow of reporting issues. And this is a good moment to introduce you to different parts of WordPress documentation. Now, the best thing you can do when leading the team, especially open source team, is to delegate responsibilities. So all these projects that you are going to see have their own representatives or project leads, and these are the people who report on progress for their projects during our weekly meetings. If you have any question about the project, you want to get involved, you go directly to them. And they, because they are volunteering, have the freedom in choosing the tools they are the most comfortable with for managing their projects. So we ended up with a different workflow for reporting and fixing issues for almost every project we have. Here we go. End user documentation, also called Help Hub internally, is located next to support forums. So that is the place where end user goes to ask for help. And it is split in two parts, general and block editor end user documentation. There is no visible difference between the two, except that block editor articles will have changelog at the bottom of the page. The real difference is behind the scenes, people who are maintaining it and the tools they are using. So, general end user documentation is created mostly in Google Documents because everyone can have access there, and then it's pasted into WordPress editor. Below each article is feedback text area, which is intended to be used for reporting issues on those articles, but people use it for different things, such as asking questions how to use WordPress. So those questions should be posted in support forums, but also we get a nice share of spam. So we need someone who's going to triage all that feedback and separate actual issues from everything else. But mostly, issues are reported in our Slack channel, and progress is tracked in Google Spreadsheets. Being on the same WordPress install, block editor and user documentation is created the same way in Google Documents, and they also have the same feedback text area, and people usually report issues in our Slack channel. However, block editor's development is extremely fast compared to the rest of the WordPress. The release cycles are 2 weeks long, and this team is trying to follow that tempo. They're using Google Documents for collecting all release changes and Trello board for tracking progress on documenting all those changes. And there is developer documentation. So it is internally called DevHub and located at developer.wordpress.org. You can find this link securely hidden in footer of wordpress.org. It consists 8 different handbooks, and we are looking at a new one very soon, 5 of which are managed by documentation team. Code reference is a specific handbook because a large part of it is generated from the code itself. There is a script that goes through all WordPress core files, collects every function, hook, class, method, and creates a page in WordPress for it. This is only for PHP documentation. We still don't have this kind of documentation for JavaScript part of WordPress, which is a lot. So description, parameters, what it returns, where it is used, since when it exists, all of that is generated from the code. The other parts of these pages that are not generated from the code, such as additional info and user-contributed notes, are created directly in WordPress. Additional info is in dashboard and by documentation team, and the user-contributed notes are actually comments. And since these comments are mostly code examples, they are held for review by the documentation team. So this is really a hybrid type of handbook and reporting issue for it. Here comes the fun part. Depends on which part of the page you found the issue. So if it's the part that is generated from the code, you would open track ticket as you would with any problem with the code. But if it's the part that is created directly in WordPress, then you would come to our Slack channel and report the issue. And this is a great moment to ask yourself, if someone was just reading the page and found a problem, how do they know which part is created where? And more importantly, why would they care? Block editor also known as Gutenberg, is the newest, bigger project in WordPress, and that can be seen in tools the team is using, such as Webpack or Grunt, which can be found in older WordPress projects. Documentation is created in the same repository by using Markdown files, which are then parsed into WordPress pages with another script. Gotta love those scripts. Reporting issues for this part of documentation is done in the same GitHub repository, so everything is pretty much clear and straightforward. The remaining three, common APIs, themes, and plugins, are created mostly the same way as general end user documentation in Google Documents, and mostly people just report issues in our Slack channel. We do plan to add that same feedback text area here and, hope for the best. And there is contributor documentation. So each team that is making WordPress has their own blog and handbook for team members and contributors. All of this is located at make.wordpress.org, and blog is used for their weekly meetings for posting agendas and summaries, while handbook is used for explaining what a team is working on, who are members, and how to get involved. So this is really a place for documenting contribution processes. And that's it. That's all how you would report any issue with any documentation project. I know how to do that only because I have repeated this so many times to anyone who showed the slightest interest in getting involved. And I was getting from them this face you see. So when repetition became too much, we wrote it down in our handbook, even recorded videos. But even then, we've been getting feedback how difficult and frustrating it is to get involved with documentation team. Again, we needed to rethink our tools, but now with different set of criteria. The perfect tool doesn't exist yet, but here are some parameters to consider when choosing one. Ideally, people should be able to report issues on the spot without ever leaving the page or being requested to do anything else, such as creating a new account, searching through some other platform, or reading guidelines how to report issues. There are two types of contributors reporting issues: those who report and move along, and those who report and want to fix it. Those who just want to report should never, ever know the workflow between the place where issue is found and place where issue is fixed. And while we want to make it easy for people to report issues, we don't want to create additional work for active contributors who are going to fix those issues. When issue is reported in Slack, that's additional work because someone needs to make sure that report doesn't get lost in Slack noise, either by pasting it somewhere else or fixing it right away. Also, if the workflow or the tool is complicated, that's additional work for experienced contributors to explain it to every new contributor, unless you document your processes and keep that documentation up to date religiously. We all know that's not going to happen. So, and even then, every workflow should be as simple as possible. We are giving our free time to these projects. It shouldn't be frustrating. This one is really no-brainer. Anything that you're going to do more than once, anything that can be automated, should be automated. And there are a lot of things in open source projects that can be automated, but really all that comes down to getting enough, but not too many, notifications about exactly what needs to be done and where at right time and right place. You see, in a project that is as large as WordPress is, the most difficult thing is to be informed about what other teams are doing. The more you are involved in one team, the less you are aware of the rest of the project. And as I said, the perfect tool doesn't exist. We couldn't find it. So we are joining other teams that have the same need as documentation teams, such as marketing and learning and training teams, and we are going to try to build it for WordPress.org. But this is still work in progress, so I cannot say more. Meanwhile, we decided to use GitHub as a central place for reporting all documentation issues for WordPress. So there are a few parameters behind these decisions, even though this is yet another account contributor needs in order to contribute. We have removed the burden of having to know the workflow to report issue. So people can just go there and report issues, and we have also removed all the other tools that we have been using. So those Google spreadsheets and Trello boards, everything is replaced with GitHub projects and GitHub issues. And in the future, we hope to use custom integration with GitHub API, so people could be able to report issue on the spot, and GitHub API will automatically create all issues and label them and send all necessary notifications. Also, contributors who want to fix issues don't have to choose which part of documentation they want to work with. They can just go to GitHub repository, find the issue they like, and start working on it. And in the future, we hope to move as much as possible documentation to GitHub, which will help with that maintenance bottleneck with granting access, and will provide a proper version control. And in WordPress community, we like to thank to all our contributors, even for the smallest contributions. But when that contribution is done in Slack by reporting issues and leaving channel, or by participating in discussion, it's very hard to get all the usernames and tag them properly. So with GitHub as a central place for reporting, discussing, and assigning issues, we hope to finally be able to track all contributors and their contributions. And when we talk about WordPress documentation, we cannot skip Gutenberg. This is a living example of how lack of proper documentation can slow down the project. For those of you who don't know, Gutenberg is a new editing experience in WordPress. Well, not so new anymore, but it's still being avoided by many developers and site builders. At the beginning, it was replacing What You See is What You Get editor, but more recently, it is expanding to a full site editing experience. So, what is wrong with Gutenberg? Gutenberg is based on React, but not just that. There is PHP layer of WordPress as we know it, and there is React layer, which is based on Gutenberg. But there is this mixed PHP and React layer, which is Gutenberg. In order to document it, we need people who understand all three layers in depth, but those people were rare, and they were busy writing the code. So we let Gutenberg be merged into core without documentation being properly adapted for PHP developers, which was majority of WordPress developers at that time. This resulted in frustrated users who refused to use it. And in WordPress, it's a common practice. When something is new, someone will write a plugin to undo the change. We are used to that. But this was much bigger. This resulted even in forking pre-Gutenberg WordPress. So when you have this large change in code base and this strong rejection by your users, you inevitably create two streams. One stream keeps working on it. I mean, it's big, it's already there. So they try to make it more attractive, better, working better. But the other stream keeps rejecting it because they have no place to learn from. But they are still seeing progress being made every day, and they are realizing just how much behind they are each day. So the frustration grows. And then you get less and less people being able to document it. So we face documentation debt. So how do you go from here? How do you fix this? very slowly, with a lot of patience. However weird it may sound, the best documentation is written by those who are using it. And this is true for all documentation. Let people go through it and point to places where it stops making sense. Give them missing information, and if they're not too frustrated, they might fill in the gaps. And you have converted documentation user into documentation writer. Congratulations. So you see, it's not perfect, far from it. WordPress as a project grew faster than we even realized we needed to adapt. There was a time when different teams could do their jobs separately, but for a while now, we are seeing our needs overlapping. We feel the necessity to communicate more, to share tools and workflows. And I think this state is partly due to our inertia. We join open source project, learn how to be a good member, and try to keep it working as it did before. It can be scary to propose something new to a project as large as WordPress is. WordPress is powering over 40% of internet, well, 43, but who's counting? It can be very frustrating to keep that kind of information in your mind. Not to mention how slow decisions are made. The bigger project, the slower movement. Sometimes we need even months for just one decision. But this is what documentation team is doing to try to move things forward. So 2 documentation projects were selected for Google Season of Docs project in 2020, during which time we collaborated with 2 technical writers who helped us create official documentation style guide and improve end-user documentation. And they loved our community, so they decided to stay as active contributors. Now, this might sound strange to you, but documentation team was never really involved in WordPress releases. I was loudly unhappy about that. So last year, I took the documentation focus lead role for 5.8 in order to learn the process and see how we can get the documentation team more involved. So in 5.8, I started doing regular reports on release during our weekly meetings and asking for volunteers. And they responded. In 5.9, I was co-leading in order to assist another person go through the same process. And we switched from using Google spreadsheets to those shiny new GitHub projects. And this is really convenient because when you create GitHub project under GitHub organization, then you can add to it every issue and every pull request from every repository inside that organization. And it was really helpful to have all of that in one place. And I continued to give my regular reports to the documentation team and ask for volunteers. Now we are at the end of 6.0, which will be out on Tuesday. And now I am co-leading with 2 other persons. And we are continuing using GitHub project, and I'm still spamming documentation team meetings. But now we are having Zoom meetings and having plan how to do things, and we are making mistakes so we can fix them in next release. And we will keep making mistakes and fixing them. And I plan to stay close to releases as much as needed until we develop a workflow that is sustainable, not heavy load on contributors, that reaches everyone it should reach, and most importantly, that is fully documented so people can easily take over. As I said, we are collaborating with other teams to create our perfect tool that will simplify our contribution processes. And this is something I'm really excited about. We are trying new workflow where every developer working on code, especially new feature, will have a dedicated documentarian who will follow along, ask questions, test code examples, and have everything explained and documented while it's being developed. We want to stop releasing undocumented code. And we don't have enough people, of course. But we hope that this opportunity to work alongside with experienced developer and learn how to do things in WordPress will attract new contributors in near future. And always document your processes, because buzz factor is real. And when we say buzz factor, it doesn't need to be that tragic. People can and they do decide to leave your project for whatever reason. The most valuable skill you can have as member of open source is enabling others to replace you. And keep in mind that there is no documentation on how to do things when project grows and expands in this capacity and time frame. We are the ones who have to rethink tools and workflows, who have to make faster decisions based on ever-changing requirements we come across. We have to stop reacting and start leading the open source evolution. And we have to document all of this for the future. If you want to learn more about documentation and open source, I can highly recommend these resources. And I would like to invite you to join WordPress community at make.wordpress.org. I personally always give cookies to documentation contributors. I am Milana Cap, WordPress engineer at XWP, and also one of WordPress documentation team representatives. My company is sponsoring my work in WordPress documentation, and they are hiring. So if you want to work with me or you have any questions, feel free to contact me through these channels. I hope you will find and embrace those inner documentarians of yours. This has been a great pleasure, and thank you so much for your time.
All right, are there any questions? It is.
So I had a question to ask you of what you feel some examples of documentation that developers think is good, but actually isn't good for end users.
Well, a good example of that is actually Gutenberg, because it has, when you compare that documentation to React documentation, it's the same. But for PHP developer, component means nothing. Where do I put it? In which file? I need steps like create index.js. Where? In theme, in plugin? So some explanation is needed. But when you talk to developers who are building Gutenberg, they're like, well, there is example, copy paste it. So there has to be this, there is this gap, and we have to bridge it somehow. We have to ask a lot of questions. The problem is not really in people who are writing it. They cannot know what you don't know unless you ask. Does that answer? Yeah. Anyone else? Or you can write it down and send it to me.
Other questions? I do have one, actually.
Okay.
What in terms of like the career progression of a technical writer? Can you give us some insights about that?
Oh, I have no idea. I was just going to write documentation because I was annoyed there was missing information, but also to learn. So I'm just going there to be better developer. I guess it depends on what you want to do with it. As a developer, I found often, with these new tools that we have, you do things in terminal and it just doesn't work. And you spend 2 hours fixing it, and you fix it, and now you have your project set and you move on. And in 3 months, you get the same error, but you have no idea how you fixed it. And now you need 3 hours because you're mad at yourself because you didn't write it down. So what I do is always doing something new. I record video just open Zoom and click record and do stuff, and also document everything, like every command, every error. This is how I fix it. This is because I'm on Linux, and this is because something else is not working. And this is how you become documentarian. I mean, documentation is a lot more than people think. Everything you write is documentation. So it depends really how you approach it and what you need it for.
Thank you. Oh, another question?
You mentioned that you want to make it easier for people to report issues who don't actually want to get involved and fix it. And one thing that I would be worried about is that there are people reading the docs who don't understand them, who are frustrated and just let it out and basically unhelpful issues. Did you see an uptick in that when you move forward with reducing the entry barrier? And how do you generally deal with those kind of issues?
Well, you would be surprised how often people will go and be unhappy on Twitter and not at the place where they should be unhappy. So we didn't see any change really in reporting issues. People who report usually issues with documentation are usually just people who are in community. Thankfully, we have large community, but there's a lot of things that we miss because, you know, nobody tells you, and then you go to Twitter and you read what's wrong and you say, oh, okay, so this is issue. We are going to fix it maybe, if we have enough people. We didn't really see any difference there.
Perfect. All right. I don't think we have any more questions. So again, give it a round of applause to Milana.
Thank you.